Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma and with me is Professor Pant. And we will have a look today at, um, at India's neighbors and how are the developments around in all these countries affecting India or India's decision making. And we will begin with China because everything else that's happening in this world these days in terms of geostrategic decisions is centered around China. Either it is countering China or ways how to counter a rising China. At the same time, China also has to brace itself for a big pushback that it is seeing from many countries. Welcome once again to this episode of Ideas Factory, Harsh. And when we look at India, China, especially in context of what happened in Eastern Ladakh, now the de-escalation is finally taking place. We know that our NSA Doval and the Foreign Minister of China have spoken. After that, the de-escalation started, the troops started moving back. We've established a buffer zone. So all that looks fine. The Chinese ambassador said that India and China should cooperate and it should be a win-win situation for both. But we know that those words have come from China even earlier. But what they say and what they do are two different things. So it's very difficult right now to trust, right now or in the long period, to trust China. There's one question. Whatever we are doing, we're also, both sides are very vigilant on the border still. And the ban on Chinese apps and the various other decisions on the economic front that have been taken, do you think China has got a message? Or, of course, India has to prepare for a long haul as far as dealing with China is concerned?
Yes, I think, notwithstanding the language that the Chinese ambassador has used, it is quite clear that it is going to be a long drawn out affair. Even I would call it what you have described as de-escalation as disengagement, because I don't think we have reached the de-escalation phase. Technically, de-escalation would involve ramping down of the military along the border. It would mean dismantling of some of the structures that have been created along the border. None of that is happening at the moment. What is happening at the moment is the two forces that were eyeball to eyeball are moving back. So they are creating a buffer between them so that, if another because it's a very inflamed situation, it's a situation where both sides' tempers are running high. So emotions do not get converted into a scuffle, and scuffles don't get converted into violence of the kind that we had witnessed before. So I think what we are witnessing is a very gradual disengagement process where the two sides, the two militaries are moving very, very gradually, very deliberately, taking steps backwards. Now, the question is whether this in itself, it's an important move, it's a confidence building move, but will it lead to de-escalation? Because de-escalation, I believe de-escalation talks will start in the second round of the NSA and special representatives meetings. So how do we go from disengagement to de-escalation is an important question. The other important question is that you have raised is the trust deficit. India will, verify, or India will be very, very cautious when it comes to what is happening on the border. Can it trust the words that are coming from the Chinese side? How far ahead do we need to move in order to demonstrate our commitment? And how far we need to see the move from the other side? I think this is a big question, and I don't think any proper mechanism or any proper move in that direction has happened yet. Yes, we have had some warm words from the ambassador. Yes, we have had some interesting wordings of the special representatives meeting after that. But clearly there are differences that the two statements also underlie, which if you read the statements after the special representatives meeting, they also have their own differences. So clearly Indians and Chinese are looking at it from their own vantage points, and to come to a converging arrangement would require a lot of effort, and therefore both sides perhaps are prepared for a long haul.
Converging arrangement, of course, is a long road ahead, as you say, and the trust deficit is very, very valid. If you look at the past experiences, there is no reason that you can immediately trust China. Also, because China has not stopped needling India. We still see what it's doing in Bhutan, especially with border with Arunachal. So while all these warm words are coming, and the right noises are being made. But you see what's happening here. And at the same time, we also look from India's perspective, we should not let our guards down. And we've just received the delivery of the Chinook and the Apaches, which the US was supposed to deliver. And so the preparations are there. The US aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan and Nimitz, they're all in South China Sea and at high alert. So all this is also there because the world recognizes increasingly the threat that's coming from China. Because China is not just sitting quiet. While this is going on, we see that the problem has started with Bhutan as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's quite incredible if you look around China's periphery, how many fights it has picked up and with how many countries. We also recently heard, and we know that, even the Natuna Islands with Indonesia have come back under a dispute, and China has raised the stakes there. As you point out, Bhutan has once again being raked up. So clearly for India, the question is, unless China demonstrates its good faith, we will have to go step by step and very, very deliberately and very, very cautiously about the next steps. But there is a larger picture that you talk about, which is, I think, developing and which has its own consequences, because clearly India is not the only country that is having to manage China in this manner. Of course, India will have to fight its own battles, but clearly there is a larger international mood that is growing anti-China, and that China needs to take into account, and I'm sure it is taking into account, and therefore the kind of words and disengagement process that you see with India is happening. But it's incredible that China at this particular point in time would pick up so many fights for a country that we long argued and many people argued has a very strategic bent of mind. It doesn't look very strategic to pick up so many fights at the same time. But clearly they are intent on doing that. They want, they think that this is a geopolitical opportunity at this particular moment in time, and it will never come back perhaps for them. Perhaps the Communist Party is internally vulnerable. Perhaps it's about Xi Jinping's leadership. But I think the fundamental point here is that China is projecting itself, rather unfortunately, as a revisionist power that is intent on tearing down every single international arrangement that it has come to terms with. So Hong Kong, what is Hong Kong about? You have a treaty, you have a declaration with UK about, which basically encapsulates the one country, two system arrangements. And that has been now relegated to the background. You have multiple arrangements with India on how to manage border that have been torn apart. You are looking at South China Sea, where ASEAN countries are now saying UNCLOS needs to be, a UN law of the sea has to be the basic parameter to guide our negotiations, but China is not bothered about it. You have the larger question about how do you go about even managing your relationships in multilateral platforms like WHO. That has been, again, the revelations from WHO keep coming every year, every time, that China did not bother to inform them that it was WHO that found out about the virus emanating from China. So clearly there is a larger picture that is emerging, that China is not interested in the kind of norms, institutions, laws that the world has come to live with in the last decades. And I think that's
like you point out, Harsh, that China is not only not interested, China doesn't care. It doesn't bother for any international order or international institution or any kind of established norm. And when you talk of Hong Kong, I also want to ask you, what's your view on this? Because the treaty with Hong Kong that was signed, the timing for breaking up the Hong Kong treaty, what is your view? Is it just because of China's rise, or China feels all powerful and it feels that its time under the sun has now come? Or is it because what's happening in the world? Well, UK is, I don't know if it's prepared or ready to fight its own battle. It has already Brexited. Then you see US is not interested in fighting UK's battle. So there's a lot of disintegration there as well. Is it because of that that it has chosen its time? Because when you look at the timing for coming out of this treaty or breaking the treaty, that's also something that needs to be looked at.
Absolutely. And I think, in some ways, I have called it Xi Jinping's revenge on the Hong Kongers for actually forcing him to withdraw the extradition bill of the last year. If you recall, it all started a year back when they tried to introduce an extradition bill, and the Hong Kongers went up in protest. It was, it was perhaps the Hong Kongers read the writing on the wall that this needs to be resisted. But unfortunately, it seems that while they managed to win the battle, they seem to be losing the war, because Xi Jinping then came back after a period of pause, has come back with a national security law that is even more dangerous. So clearly for Xi Jinping, it is about restoring his authority on Hong Kong. It is about using this particular moment in time where countries are mired in multiple crises, where countries are looking inwards, and perhaps a country like UK, for example, that has the greatest stake here, would not have the time or the energy to invest in Hong Kong, to come back. Beijing wanted to come back and demonstrate to Hong Kongers who's the real boss, who will manage their future, and how it will be managed, completely brushing aside the sentiment. Now, if you were really cognizant of the sentiment of the Hong Kongers on the street, you would never have done that after the fiasco of the extradition bill. But I think for CCP, it is as important to demonstrate its ability to manage its periphery, its ability to manage these territories which are contentious, and also send a message to entities like Taiwan that, look, the world will not come to your aid, and we are here, we are making this, it is our land, we will make the law as we deem fit, even if that means, damaging our credibility about international law. They don't care. There is a sense of the nonchalance about, whether you want to engage with the global order or not, because I think there is a sense that they can get away with it, and they got away with it last time, and they almost got away with it. It was the Hong Kongers that actually protested. None of the world reacted in any way. I mean, none of the world could do anything. All the nice words were said, but none of the countries, major powers, did anything about it. Now, this time, of course, it's a bit different. We have seen in UNHCR, Human Rights Council, HRC, UNHRC, where 27 countries have actually responded and asked China to take this back. They have asked UNHRC to investigate. They have, Britain is taking a slightly more robust stand. Australia has also said that it is looking at its extradition arrangements, its immigration arrangements with Hong Kong. India, interestingly, made a very interesting intervention, which is again interesting because India made it. For the first time, India was perhaps arguing that the issue of Hong Kong is a matter that is of grave concern to the globe as well as to India. And I think that's a move that comes in the context of this larger Sino-Indian tension, where India wants to project a sense that everything is up in the air as far as China is concerned, and India would not hesitate to take up issues which in the past India thought it would not, because of not wanting to rock the boat with the Chinese.
But Harsh, what does it really mean for India after China implemented the national security law, which gives sweeping powers to the authorities for any kind of crackdown? But surely we know that there is not going to be political stability, and we know that we have trade relations with Hong Kong. Hong Kong probably was, the imports from Hong Kong were quite high, and it was sixth in number as far as the countries from where we import is concerned. So now, if there is no political stability there, or if there is a problem of this sort, what does it really mean for India? Because to do trade, you need that kind of stability, which Hong Kong provided earlier.
Yes, and I think it is a global issue now, because the fact that Hong Kong could emerge as one of the most significant financial hubs in the world, in Asia in particular, despite being under the Communist Party's rule since 1997, that allowed, that is a very significant marker as far as the global economy is concerned. And an issue that I think we have been talking about for some time, that is the fragmentation of the global economic order, is being witnessed in China itself. That China now is looking at the reality where Hong Kong, which used to be its gateway to the world, in fact, is now no longer will be looked at in the same way. You will have investors that were, as you point out, they looked at the legal stability in Hong Kong, part of the British system, with a certain degree of confidence, that China is problematic, mainland China is problematic, but Hong Kong is something that you could invest, you could trade with, you use its ability to mobilize financial resources, because that operated under a different model. That there was a legal sanctity to the order that was that was there, and now suddenly you find Hong Kong being left bereft of that sentiment, and it would have an impact on the larger global sentiment. It would have an impact on how India looks at it, because clearly, even in the statement that India made it very clear that we have a significant number of Indians who work there as professionals. apart from the trade and investment, we are also looking at our own our own professionals, especially in IT and banking, which play a very, very important role. And now I think a lot of that would be under the scanner, a lot of that would be under discussion, and a lot of that would be about whether that model of Hong Kong being an autonomous entity needs to be relooked at, not only by India, but by the wider world, and what sort of consequences it will have on, on an already fragmented globalization that we're witnessing. And so I think,
So, yes.
we are moving towards a phase where you will have multiple aspects of globalization emerging in different contexts. And in this case, Hong Kong and what China is trying to do in Hong Kong will leave a very, very strong message to the world that China needs to be kept out, and Hong Kong will have the role of Hong Kong in global economy, in Asian economy, will have to be reassessed.
Of course, the role has to be reassessed, and how is it going to go forward? And what is also worrying for India is right now when we have banned certain apps, Chinese apps, and we're also trying to be more self-reliant and cut down on our imports from China. But it is a worry that will significant indirect inflow of Chinese goods. Should it be a cause of concern if we look at it coming through places with which India has free trade agreement or preferential trade agreements? So all that is also a worry. But now also let's look at, in one of your articles you talk about the the Chinese expansionism in terms of its nuclear capability and also modernization, while America and Russia are at least trying to cut down on the nuclear arsenal or reduce the size of the nuclear arsenal. But China seems to go in an expansionist mode, and it is also modernizing it. But is this something that should worry India? While we are discussing this, because we've just had a very, very bloody face-off in Eastern Ladakh. And when we look at what is China doing on the nuclear front, even in terms of a conventional escalation, this should be a worry for India. So should India shore up its deterrent nuclear capability if you look at what China is doing?
Well, I think, for a long time, this argument has been made about China's military nuclear modernization and China's belief in a credible minimum deterrent, which is not very different from our belief in a credible minimum deterrent. And at times, this has happened that, look, India and China have relatively similar views on how they view deterrence. Now, China being, this perception of China that it has arrived on the global stage, now wants to match its steps with what perhaps America has done or American capability. So I think, Russia, of course, is a different ball game. But for China, the real marker is what America is doing and what American capabilities in the nuclear area. So their modernization is geared towards that. Now, for India, of course, it presents a very complicated threat, because on the one hand, I think most Indian policymakers would like to have the principles on which nuclear deterrence is found in India, would like to maintain that deterrence. That gradually, that credible minimum deterrence model, second strike capability model has served India very well. We don't believe nuclear weapons are an instruments of war fighting. We believe they are political instruments of deterrence, and we will continue to project them as such. While we want to enhance our basic deterrence in terms of the triad, we don't want to overdo that. Now, that is something that inevitably you will be forced into a reassessment, because China's expansion is being driven by a much wider factor, which is the American military arsenal. And Americans and the Russians have been under a nuclear ambit, but that is also under a question now with the INF treaty being suspended, and America walking out of that. But clearly, even in the American minds, the question is, what is China doing and how can China be brought in as a very important factor? All the arms control, nuclear arms control that we have today is largely premised on Cold War nuclear realities. And those Cold War nuclear realities no longer apply. If for America, Russia is a problem, but the growing power of China is a real issue today. It's not that, if the new Cold War happens, it will happen with China. So clearly for America, that contention is the most important one. For India, therefore, we will have to keep on assessing where China is moving with its nuclear arsenal. And unfortunately, sometimes when we have these discussions about China, we miss out this picture, because nuclear context is a very important context which has been existing now in the South Asian subcontinent ever since China became a nuclear weapon power in 1964. So for us, it is very important to take that into account and to keep on reassessing that, whether our credible minimum deterrent, which worked or which may even work in today's context, will be enough for us to give us a deterrent posture which will be credible enough in the near future. And I think that's a debate that India should have and should continue to have regularly, rather than in fits and starts.
So China's nuclear arsenal rose from 290 warheads in 2019 to 320 warheads in 2030, according to CIPRI. This is the data. And also China has this DF Dongfeng 26 IRBM with a range of 4,000 kilometers, which pretty much covers all of India. So like you're saying, India should have these debates. But before we move on to India's invitation to Australia for the Malabar exercise, we also see how the world is reacting, and we look at Australia's policies. Australia has unveiled new defense policies, which are, you look at it as it's a step in countering China's threat. So when India invites Australia for the Malabar exercises, now we have all the 4 members of Quad for the first time participating in these exercises. So do we see a more active Quad, and do we see the Quad countries taking on a more active role in countering the threat from China in the Indo-Pacific area and to maintain the peace and stability there? How significant is this step?
I think, very significant, particularly I think when it comes, the timing of it. My sense is that it would have, it was inevitable, in some ways. It would have happened, if not this year, then next year or the year after. But clearly with this, once again, India's message to China is very clear that all the older assumptions that we had about each other's behavior will have to be reassessed by both sides. India will not assume that China will behave in a particular manner, and that India will not trust Chinese behavior going forward. Similarly, I think India's message to China is that please, we want to keep you on tenterhooks. We also have ways in which we can show or demonstrate that we are willing to reassess the relationship in some fundamental ways. And I think for a long time, you can go back to the history of Quad. In 2007, it came into being. Australians and Indians both decided that it was not worth it at that point. And the main argument then was that, look, it would needlessly provoke China. But what happened? The disbanding of Quad did not really, help in terms of our building ties with China.
China was provoked anyways.
So it became even more aggressive. So the reality was, by 2017, all the countries of the Quad, all 4 countries, decided that it's perhaps best to move ahead with this arrangement. The problem there has always been, and many people have argued, many observers have argued, that it did not have enough teeth, that it does not have enough teeth. And so I think this idea that hard power is being now factored into this quadrilateral arrangement is a very important sign that all 4 countries, even those countries that were perhaps more cognizant of Chinese sensitivities in the past, are willing to relook at some of those assumptions and are now willing to engage with each other more substantively, so as to create a more stable balance of power, rather than leaving the field open for Chinese ambitions.
So this is the first time Australia is going to participate in these exercises, which started in 1992 with just the India and the US. It was like a bilateral exercise, but now all the 4 countries are going to participate here. And we've seen that Scott Morrison's government has unveiled a more aggressive defense strategy. Now, if we move to Nepal as a final question, what's happening there? We know that Nepal has banned the private channels, Indian private news channels, for accusing them of propaganda, but they have a right to do that. But how difficult is the situation for Oli? The meetings have been postponed now for another week, and what does the future look like?
I think very complicated, and Mr. Oli, I think, is playing a game that perhaps has already backfired on him. I think, this, from the very beginning, he seemed needlessly aggressive, and I could sense, one could make out that perhaps his position was very weak, and he, instinctive anti-Indian sort of sentiment is sometimes helpful for people in power. It generates a momentum in their favor, which it did for a while. But I think now increasingly, as as his own position gets weakened, with his own, political leadership question, with his own people around him questioning his value, things are becoming murkier. And in particular, I think, this open Chinese involvement in the process, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, even when
Can
Indians,
China save him? That's also a question. Will
yes,
China come?
China had saved him once. They clearly saved him once. This time, attempts are going on. Now, the question is this kind of blatant, Chinese intervention. See, whenever we used to talk of Indian intervention in Nepal, uh, let's be honest about it, there is an Indian engagement that keeps on happening. But look, the blame is always on Indian intelligence agencies. This time, the blame is not on Chinese intelligence. It's very, very clearly Chinese diplomats in Nepal are playing a game, which is quite extraordinary. So I think for many Nepalese, it must be quite disheartening that while they are all for coming out of the Indian hegemony, the Chinese hegemony is very palpable, and Chinese hegemony is manifesting itself in ways that is quite detrimental to the larger interests of democracy in Nepal. Forget about India and Indian interests. It's for Nepalese democracy. You can't expect China as a communist party state to help Nepalese democracy to thrive. So they have no interest in Nepalese democracy. The question is, are the stakeholders in Nepal willing to look at this, frontally and challenge it, given the high stakes that China has developed and Nepalese policymakers have developed? My sense is Mr. Oli's position is becoming very, very vulnerable, and the others on the sidelines will become more forceful in their articulation.
The question is, can China stand up to, can Nepal stand up to China? Sorry, can Nepal stand up? Because
that is in a sense the most important question, I think, and it is for Nepalese Democrats and Nepalese policymakers to make sure that what the blatant use of Nepalese open democracy by the Chinese to serve their ends needs to be put an end, and they need to stand up and speak for Nepalese democracy, not for India. I mean, India can take care of its own interests. India can deal with China directly. But for Nepal and for the viability of democracy in Nepal, I think this is a very important inflection point.
And, as you said, Mr. Oli's future looks very complicated and murky, and we can only wait and see what role does China play there, and can China save him once again. Thank you so much. But that's all from us on this episode of India Ideas Factory.
Thank you. Thank you.